The women moved in a huddled group, their bodies hunched against the punishing cold, their feet dragging through the knee-high drifts. Each breath burned, every movement was pain, but stopping meant death. Eliza Monroe led the way, though her legs trembled beneath her. She had once walked with pride, with purpose. Now she staggered forward on feet she could no longer feel, her hands curled into stiff claws inside the torn fabric of her gloves. Her lips, cracked and bleeding, pressed together as she threw a glance back at the others. They were falling behind. Maggie Carter, once the strongest among them, had collapsed onto her hands and knees, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Her long auburn hair had frozen to the back of her neck, tiny icicles clinging to the ends. Her face was nearly as pale as the snow beneath her. "We have to keep moving," Eliza urged, her voice barely carrying over the wind. She reached for Maggie's arm, but the woman flinched. "Get up." Maggie's gaze was unfocused, her lips moving without sound. Eliza crouched lower, pressing her forehead against Maggie's, her breath warm against the other woman's frozen skin. "Don't let them win," she whispered. Maggie's fingers twitched, the memory of those who had cast them out flickering across her face. It had been her brother-in-law, Tom, the one who had smiled so easily as he took everything she had. Her husband's land, her home, her dignity, then finally her life, or at least what he had assumed was the last of it. He had tossed her from the house in the dead of winter, like garbage, and she had wandered, stunned, until she found the others. Eliza gave Maggie's arm a sharp tug, and the woman gasped as pain jolted her awake. Together, they forced her to her feet. Not far behind, Rose Gallagher was swaying on her feet, clutching her arms to her chest as if she could will warmth back into her bones. Her usual smirk was long gone, her green eyes filled with something brittle, something on the edge of breaking. She had been a saloon girl once, selling laughter and whiskey smiles, but when the owner decided she was of no more use, he sent her into the cold. He hadn't even pretended to care. "I can't feel my hands," she murmured, though no one could hear her. Beside her, Hannah Porter moved with mechanical determination, her face expressionless, the only sign of her struggle the rigid way she clenched her jaw. Of all of them, she had lost the most. A child, stolen from her arms, ripped away by the very family that had once sworn to protect her. She had begged them, pleaded for mercy, but they had only called her weak, called her a burden. And so, into the storm she went. Sarah Yates was the last, limping behind the others, pressing a shaking hand against her ribs, where she had been kicked before being tossed from her family's cabin. She had fought hard, and they had beaten her harder. A reminder, they had said. A warning to any other woman who thought she could stand against a father's rule. The 5 women had found each other, all discarded by the people who were supposed to love them. A cruel joke played by fate, tying their fates together in this endless winter. None of them knew how far they had walked, how long it had been since the warmth of a fire had kissed their skin. They only knew one thing. They were going to die. Eliza wouldn't let it happen. She forced herself forward, each step in agony she refused to acknowledge. "Keep moving," she said, though her throat was raw, her voice barely more than a whisper. The storm screamed in response, shaking the earth, blurring the horizon until the world was nothing but white. Then came the sound, a low guttural growl. The wind carried it from the darkened trees ahead, a whisper of something that did not belong to the storm. Eliza's heart stilled. Another growl. Closer. Her frozen fingers wrapped around a stick buried beneath the snow, though she knew it was useless. Then she saw them. Eyes, glowing yellow in the twilight, stalking forward on silent paws. Wolves. 1, 2, 3. More hidden in the trees. Their hunger was a living thing, etched into the sharpness of their ribs, the gleam of their fangs. Rose gasped, stepping back, her breath a burst of white mist. Maggie clutched at Eliza's arm. "What do we do?" Eliza didn't answer. She knew there was no fighting this, not in their condition. The wolves had likely been tracking them for hours, waiting for weakness, for collapse. Sarah's breath hitched. "We don't have." A snarl cut through her words as the largest of the wolves lunged. Time slowed. Eliza shoved Maggie aside as the beast leaped for her, its jaws snapping inches from her face. She swung the stick wildly, striking its flank, but the creature barely flinched. The others closed in, circling, their movements careful, practiced. Rose screamed. Hannah stumbled back, hands raised as if she could ward them off with nothing but sheer will. Then, the sharp whistle of an arrow cut through the storm. The lead wolf collapsed mid-leap, its body thudding against the snow. A second arrow, then a third. Shapes moved in the shadows beyond the trees, figures wrapped in thick furs, their faces obscured. Eliza barely had time to process before the remaining wolves fled, vanishing into the storm as quickly as they had come. The figures approached. Warriors. Lakota. Eliza's breath shuddered in her lungs, every part of her trembling with exhaustion. She tried to stand straight, to gather the last shreds of her dignity, but her body betrayed her. One of the warriors, taller than the rest, stepped forward. His dark eyes studied them, his expression unreadable. He said something in Lakota, but Eliza did not understand. Maggie clutched at her, whispering, "What do we do?" Eliza could only stare at the man before her, his fur-lined coat, the bow still gripped in his hand. He had saved them, and now he had the power to decide whether they lived or died. The warrior spoke again, this time in slow, measured English. "You should not be here." Eliza, her body broken, her will stretched thin, could only manage a single word in return. "Help." There was a long silence. The storm raged on around them. But here, in the small space where the wind had momentarily stilled, everything held its breath. Finally, the warrior gave a short nod, gesturing to his companions. The last thing Eliza felt before her knees buckled was strong hands catching her, lifting her away from the snow. Then darkness. Warmth. It came slowly, creeping into Eliza's frozen limbs like the hesitant fingers of spring after a brutal winter. She was floating, or at least it felt that way, her body weightless yet somehow heavy, anchored in exhaustion. The scent of smoke and pine filled her senses, mingled with something herbal, sharp yet soothing. A murmur of voices drifted around her, low and unfamiliar, speaking words she couldn't grasp. Her eyelids fluttered. Dim light filtered through what looked like stretched hide, flickering as shadows moved beyond it. A tent. The realization settled in her mind just as the rest of her body finally responded. Pain surged back, dull but present, a reminder that she was alive, that she had been saved. Eliza inhaled sharply, her breath catching on the lingering ache in her ribs as she tried to sit up. A hand pressed gently but firmly against her shoulder, urging her back down. "You need to rest." The voice was soft yet steady, carrying the weight of authority. Eliza turned her head, her vision adjusting to the face before her. A woman, perhaps in her 30s, knelt beside her, dark hair woven into 2 long braids adorned with small beads. Her features were sharp, yet there was kindness in her deep-set eyes. "Where?" Eliza's voice cracked, her throat dry as dust. "You are safe," the woman said, offering her a small bowl. "Drink." Eliza hesitated, but took it, her hands barely strong enough to lift the bowl to her lips. The liquid was bitter, thick, and earthy, sending warmth spreading through her chest as she swallowed. The woman nodded in approval. "You were close to death. Your friends, too." Eliza's fingers tightened around the bowl. "The others? They are alive." Relief rushed through her, but it was short-lived. Their fate was still uncertain. Footsteps approached. The entrance to the tent shifted, and a man stepped inside. His presence filled the space instantly, broad shoulders wrapped in thick furs, dark eyes assessing. The warrior from the forest. Chaska. His gaze swept over her before settling on the healer. "How is she?" "She will live," the woman, White Fawn, replied. Chaska said nothing for a moment, then turned back to Eliza. "You are in our winter camp. We brought you here when we found you in the storm." His voice was calm, but there was something unreadable beneath it. Eliza met his gaze, forcing herself to sit up straighter. "You saved us." A beat of silence. "Then we did." She could hear the weight of his unspoken words. "But should we have?" Eliza swallowed, forcing herself to hold his stare. "Thank you." Chaska inclined his head slightly, but his expression remained impassive. "You should regain your strength. We will speak more soon." With that, he turned and left, the hide door rustling shut behind him. Eliza let out a slow breath, feeling the exhaustion settle deep in her bones. The days that followed were a blur of slow recovery. The women had been given shelter in separate tents, tended to by White Fawn and the others who knew the ways of healing. Their wounds were treated with salves, their strength rebuilt with warm broth and carefully portioned meals. Maggie was the first to regain herself, her stubbornness refusing to let her remain weak for long. She tested the limits of her body, stretching and pacing inside the tent, muttering curses under her breath about being helpless. Hannah remained quiet, withdrawn. She ate when given food, accepted care without complaint, but her eyes carried a distance, as if part of her was still lost in a storm. Rose, ever the restless spirit, spoke the most, though her words were often edged with a cautious kind of humor. She made jokes about their circumstances, about how she'd never expected to wake up in the care of warriors instead of the afterlife. Sarah, though, was the worst off. She had taken the brunt of the cold, her body weaker than the rest. She hardly spoke, her energy spent on simply staying alive. They were safe, for now. But safety was fragile, and they all knew it. On the third day, White Fawn brought them outside for the first time. The world was endless and white, the snow stretching in every direction, yet within the camp, life bustled. Smoke curled from the tops of tents. Children ran past, laughing despite the cold, and men moved with purpose, tending to the horses, checking supplies. It was a world foreign to them, yet it was clear these people knew how to survive when others could not. Chaska stood near the center of the camp, speaking with two other warriors. His gaze flicked to Eliza as she stepped out, but he said nothing. "Come," White Fawn said. "You need to move or your strength will never return." The women followed her, hesitant at first, but soon the cold became a little less cruel as they walked. Days turned into a week. The women were not idle. Maggie, impatient with recovery, began helping in small ways, fetching water, carrying wood, anything to keep herself from feeling useless. She earned nods of approval from some of the Lakota men, though others still regarded them with caution. Hannah took to sitting with White Fawn, learning the uses of herbs, watching as the healer crushed dried leaves into powders, pressing mixtures into small pouches. Rose found herself drawn to the horses, lingering near the edges of the camp where they were kept. It was there she met an older man who showed her how to braid the horses' manes, how to move without startling them. She listened, for once, without protest. Sarah struggled the most. Her body still weak, she spent most of her time inside, though White Fawn made sure she walked a little each day. It wasn't much, but it was something. Eliza, as always, was the one watching everything. She saw how some of the Lakota people accepted them, how others remained distant, their eyes filled with suspicion. She saw the way Chaska kept his distance, yet always seemed aware of where they were. She saw the way Maggie clenched her fists when she thought of the past, the way Rose laughed but never let herself fully relax, the way Hannah stared into the fire at night, lost in thoughts she never voiced. One evening, as the sky burned red with the setting sun, Chaska approached her. "You learn fast," he said, nodding toward where she had been helping carry firewood. Eliza wiped her hands on her skirts. "We don't have the luxury of not learning." Chaska studied her for a long moment. "You do not belong here." Eliza's heart clenched. "I know. You should have died." She exhaled slowly. "I know that too." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. "What do you intend to do?" It was the question she had been asking herself since she woke. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I won't let the people who did this to us believe we simply disappeared." Something flickered in Chaska's eyes. "That will bring trouble." Eliza lifted her chin. "Trouble already found us." For the first time, Chaska almost smiled. He nodded once, then walked away, leaving her standing there, the cold wind biting at her face. That night, as the fire crackled and the others drifted into exhausted sleep, Eliza stared up at the sky, the stars burning bright above her. She didn't know what would come next. But for the first time since she had been cast out, she felt something other than fear. She felt ready. The fire crackled low, its embers glowing against the cold night. The women sat in silence, their faces illuminated by the flickering light, each lost in thought. The warmth of the Lakota camp had given them strength, but it had also given them time to remember. And remembering was dangerous. Eliza turned the knife over in her hands, its edge sharpened to a fine point. It was a gift, though she knew it had not been given lightly. Chaska had placed it in her palm earlier that evening without a word, his gaze steady, his meaning clear. There would come a time to use it. That time was near. Maggie was the first to speak. "We can't stay here forever." Rose let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "No, I reckon not. But going back." She exhaled sharply. "They left us for dead. They won't be happy to see ghosts walk into town. They'll wish we were ghosts when we're through with them." Maggie's voice was hard, her hands clenched in her lap. Hannah rubbed at her wrist absently, her expression unreadable. "We need to think this through. We aren't just walking into town to prove a point. If we go back, it has to mean something." Eliza nodded, her grip tightening around the knife. "It means justice." Sarah, frail but recovering, spoke for the first time. "Justice." She let out a breath, bitter and weary. Or revenge. The question settled heavily over them. Eliza knew what Sarah meant, but there was no room for hesitation now. "Justice," she repeated, as much for herself as for them. "We don't go back just to settle scores. We go back to make sure this doesn't happen again, to show them they don't get to decide when we stop breathing." Maggie let out a breath, steadying herself. "Then we need a plan." The next morning, Chaska stood waiting as the women emerged from their tent. His expression was unreadable as always, but his arms were crossed, his stance firm. "You're leaving." Eliza met his gaze. "We are." Chaska studied them, his dark eyes moving from woman to woman. Finally, he sighed. "You are not ready." Maggie's hands twitched at her sides. "We don't have a choice." Chaska nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. "Then you will not go alone." Eliza blinked, surprised. "You're helping us?" Chaska's lips quirked slightly. "You are stubborn. But you are also right. If you disappear into the world without a trace, the people who did this to you will never answer for their sins." He turned to his warriors, nodding once. "We ride at first light." The journey back was slow, the land stretching wide before them, cold and quiet beneath the weight of what was to come. Every mile they covered brought them closer to the people who had tried to bury them. Maggie rode ahead, her shoulders rigid with barely contained fury. Eliza knew what awaited her in town, the brother-in-law who had stolen her land, the man who had laughed as he threw her to the cold. Rose rode beside her, quieter than usual, her lips pressed together in a thin line. Hannah rode at the back, her gaze drifting to the horizon. She hadn't spoken much since they left. Eliza knew why. Her child. Somewhere in that town, her baby was alive, growing up in the hands of those who had torn them apart. Sarah rode between them all, her grip loose on the reins. She still looked weak, but there was steel in her now, an unshakable core that had not been there before. Eliza rode beside Chaska. "You do not have to do this," he said, his voice low. "I do," she replied. He gave a small nod, and they rode on. By dusk, the town came into view. The familiar sight of wooden buildings and flickering lanterns made Eliza's chest tighten. It looked the same as when they had been cast out, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. They stopped at the edge of town, the Lakota warriors keeping their distance, watching from the shadows. This was their fight. Eliza inhaled deeply. "We do this together." Maggie was the first to step forward. She moved with purpose, her boots striking hard against the frozen ground as she made her way to the center of town. People turned to stare, murmurs rising around them like wind through dry grass. Someone gasped, "It's them." Another whispered they were supposed to be dead. Tom Carter, Maggie's brother-in-law, stepped from the saloon, a mug of ale in his hand. His face went slack at the sight of her. He recovered quickly, scowling. "What the hell is this?" Maggie stood tall. "It's me, Tom. Back from the dead." Tom scoffed, but there was unease in his eyes. "You ain't supposed to be here." "Neither's my land," Maggie shot back. "But you've been keeping it warm for me, haven't you?" Tom's grip tightened on his mug. "You don't get to just come back." Maggie stepped closer, her voice steady. "I was never gone." Rose moved next, striding toward the saloon keeper, the man who had thrown her out when she was no longer useful. "Got anything to say to me?" she asked. The man's face darkened. "You don't belong here." Rose smiled coldly. "I never did I?" Hannah's eyes swept the street, searching. Then she saw them. A woman, standing on the steps of the church, a small boy at her side. Her breath hitched. "Daniel," she whispered. The boy turned, confused, and in that instant, Hannah's resolve hardened. She walked forward, slow, deliberate. The woman on the steps, her sister-in-law, went rigid. "What are you doing here?" the woman hissed. Hannah didn't stop. "Give me my son." The tension in the air thickened. Eliza stepped forward, her voice carrying across the street. "You all thought you could erase us, that you could cast us aside and move on." She swept her gaze over them, meeting familiar faces, faces that had once smiled at them before turning their backs. "But you were wrong." A ripple of unease moved through the gathered crowd. A voice called out from the sheriff's office. "You're causing a disturbance." The sheriff himself stepped onto the porch, one hand resting on his gun. He studied them for a long moment before shaking his head. "You should leave." Sarah, still pale, still weaker than the rest, lifted her chin. "No." Eliza's fingers curled into fists. "You let this happen. You stood by while women were thrown out to die." The sheriff's expression darkened. "That's the way things are." "No." Eliza stepped closer. "That's the way you let them be." A shot rang out. The world shattered into chaos. Maggie dove to the side, her body reacting faster than her mind. Rose pulled a knife from her boot, eyes wild. Chaska and his warriors moved to shadows, quick and decisive. Tom Carter lay on the ground, clutching his leg, his own pistol knocked from his grip. Eliza stood over him, her breath ragged, the smoke from her gun curling in the cold air. Silence fell. The town held its breath. Then, one by one, people turned away. The sheriff hesitated, but then he too stepped back, shaking his head. No one would fight for the men who had tried to bury them. Hannah took another step forward. "Daniel," she whispered again. The boy looked at her, uncertain, but his small fingers curled around hers. It was enough. Eliza inhaled deeply, her heart pounding. They had won, but not in the way she expected. They weren't here for blood. They were here to be seen. And they had been. The wind had shifted. No longer did it howl with the same bitter force that had once carried them into the wilderness, stripping them of warmth, of dignity, of hope. Now it was different, cool, steady, carrying the scent of pine and cold iron, of change. The town lay silent in the wake of their stand, the tension still thick in the air. But the battle had already been decided. Eliza breathed heavily, her fingers still clenched around the grip of her gun. The sharp tang of gunpowder lingered between them and the men who had once claimed power over them. Tom Carter lay in the dirt, his legs slick with blood, his breath coming in short, pained bursts. No one moved to help him. Maggie stood above him, her face unreadable. Once he had been family. Once she had trusted him, believed in the bond they shared. Now there was nothing between them but betrayal and the weight of justice long overdue. "You should have killed me," Tom spat, his voice ragged. His hand twitched toward his fallen pistol, but Maggie pressed her boot against his wrist, grinding it into the dirt. "No," she said quietly. "That's the difference between you and me. I don't throw away life like it's worthless." Tom's lip curled, but his strength was fading. He would never walk the same again. And worse, he knew it. Eliza turned away, scanning the street. People still watched from behind windows and doorways, their faces half-lit by lanterns. Their fear was different now, laced not with horror, but with something deeper, something uncomfortable. They had been forced to look at themselves, to acknowledge what they had allowed to happen. Hannah clutched her son tightly to her chest. His small fingers curled in her hair. He did not cry, though his wide eyes flicked from face to face, trying to make sense of what had unfolded. The woman who had stolen him away, his so-called guardian, stood on the steps of the church, her face pale with disbelief. "He's mine," Hannah said, her voice steady, unshakable. "And I am taking him home." The woman opened her mouth, but the sheriff's voice cut through the air. "She's right." Everyone turned to look at him. He stood at the edge of the street, his shoulders slumped, his expression unreadable. "It was never legal what you did." He exhaled sharply. None of it was. There it was. The quiet admission of guilt. Too little, too late. Hannah clutched her son closer, as if she could shield him from all the things he had lost, all the things she had suffered. She would never forget, but she would move forward. Sarah swayed where she stood, pale and exhausted, but resolute. The fever had taken its toll on her, the journey even more so, but still, she straightened. What happens now? The sheriff let out a slow breath, glancing at the people of the town. "That's up to all of you." The silence stretched long and thin, but Eliza knew the answer. It was written in the way no one stepped forward to stop them, in the way the fear had shifted, not toward them, but toward what they represented. Change. No one wanted to face them again. Eliza holstered her gun. "We've said what we needed to say." She looked to the others, their faces lined with exhaustion, with pain, but also something else, relief. They had won, not just by surviving, but by standing, by refusing to disappear. Maggie's gaze lingered on Tom, then she turned away, her chin lifted. "Let's go." One by one, they moved toward their horses. The Lakota warriors, ever watchful, waited at the edge of town, their presence a silent reminder that they had never been alone in this fight. Chaska met Eliza's gaze as she reached for the reins of her horse. Satisfied. Eliza hesitated, then nodded. "For now." He gave a small, knowing smile. "That's the problem with justice. It never lasts long." She exhaled. "No, but it lasts long enough." They rode out of town without looking back. The land stretched before them, untouched and endless. Snow still lay thick upon the earth, but it no longer seemed as merciless as before. There was a path now, one they had carved for themselves, through fire and fury, through pain and perseverance. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden rays across the white expanse. It was beautiful in a way Eliza hadn't noticed before. Maggie rode beside her, her grip firm on the reins. "What now?" Eliza glanced at her, then at the others, each of them carrying the weight of what they had endured, what they had reclaimed. "We live," she said simply. They rode on, toward whatever future waited for them beyond the snow.
The night smelled of rain, thick and heavy in the air, as Eleanor Calloway urged her horse forward through the twisting trail home. The wind hummed low through the pines, rattling the dry grass beneath her boots. She shifted in the saddle, an uneasy feeling curling in her stomach. It was too quiet. Home wasn't far now, just past the ridge and down the sloping path where the lantern light of the cabin should have been visible. But as she crested the hill, her heart kicked against her ribs. The lanterns were dark. The place looked hollow, as if something had already been taken from it. She swung down from the saddle, boot heels hitting the dirt with a dull thud. The door to the cabin was ajar, swinging slightly with the breeze. From inside, voices muttered low. Her father's voice, low and gruff. Another voice, unfamiliar, with a slithering drawl. She stepped forward, careful, steady, a habit learned from years of living on the frontier. The old wooden planks groaned beneath her weight as she pushed the door open just enough to see. Her father, Jed Calloway, sat slumped in his chair by the cold hearth, an empty bottle cradle between his knees. Across from him, a man lounged, one boot resting atop the table, spurs glinting in the dim firelight. He had a jagged scar cutting across his cheek, dark eyes like flint, and a slow, mean smile curling his lips. "I gave you the girl, McGraw," her father muttered, rubbing his temples. "Took the money. Ain't no turning back now. The words sent a jagged shock through Eleanor's chest. She stood frozen, her mind trying to catch up. McGraw's smile deepened. Then why ain't she here? His voice was all honey and rot. I told you, Jed grumbled, running a hand over his unshaven jaw. She's out riding. She don't know nothing. Eleanor took a slow step backward, a cold sweat breaking across her skin. Her father had no. It couldn't be. McGraw leaned forward, setting his boot down with a deliberate thud. We had an agreement, Calloway. The girl for the debt. Ain't no renegotiating that. A sudden sharp crack of knuckles against what sent her heart racing. She turned too fast, her heel catching the edge of a loose board. The noise echoed like a gunshot in the stillness. McGraw's head snapped toward the doorway. Well, he murmured, eyes gleaming. Speak of the devil. Eleanor ran. She spun, bolting for the door, her breath sharp in her chest. Footsteps pounded behind her, too fast, too close. A hand snagged the back of her dress, yanking her hard. She twisted, throwing an elbow into whoever had grabbed her. A grunt, then fingers tightened around her arm like iron. Now, McGraw crooned, dragging her back into the room. Ain't no sense in running, darling. She fought, kicking, thrashing, but he was too strong. Another man, one of his lackeys, stepped in, shoving her against the wall. Her father still sat slumped in his chair, not moving, not even looking at her. She gasped for breath. Pa, she choked out, betrayal burning in her throat. Tell me this ain't true. Jed finally turned his bleary eyes toward her. I ain't got a choice, girl, he muttered. Her stomach twisted so violently she thought she might be sick. McGraw chuckled, gripping her chin between his fingers, forcing her to look at him. You're gonna make me a fine little fortune, girl. She spat in his face. The laughter died in his throat. He wiped his cheek, slow, measured, then backhanded her so hard her ears rang. Feisty, he murmured. I do like that. The world spun as she hit the floor, pain exploding along her jaw. She tasted blood. Get her on a horse, McGraw ordered, already turning back toward her father. And if you grow a conscience, Calloway, you best pray I don't find out. Rough hands dragged her upright. She twisted, wrenching against them, but they shoved her forward, out into the night. Her horse stood tethered where she had left it, but they didn't put her on it. Instead, they pulled her toward a massive black gelding, its eyes rolling white. A man hoisted her up into the saddle, tying her wrists in front of her. She sucked in a shaking breath, trying to steady her pounding heart. No one was coming for her. She had no one left. McGraw swung up onto his own horse, reining it toward the dark stretch of forest. Ride out, he called to his men, and just like that, they were gone. The first mile, she barely moved, her muscles tight with the shock of what had just happened. Her father had sold her, handed her over like livestock. She had known he was a broken man, but this was something else. The night deepened around them, the sky black and star-scattered, the thick trees swallowing any light from the sliver of moon above. The men rode in silence, save for the occasional murmur or the creak of saddles. Eleanor swallowed against the fear lodged in her throat. Panic wouldn't help her now. She had to think. She glanced at the ropes binding her wrists. Too tight. No chance of slipping free without help. She shifted, testing the saddle. They hadn't tied her feet. If she could get a chance if they weren't watching. A voice cut through the quiet. Don't even think about it, girl. She turned sharply. One of McGraw's men rode beside her, his expression smug beneath the wide brim of his hat. You jump, we'll find you. And I promise you won't like what happens next. She set her jaw, forcing her face into stone. The man chuckled. Smart. The night stretched on, the rhythmic plod of hooves the only sound. Then from the shadows of the tree line, something moved. It was only a flicker at first, barely noticeable in the dim light. A figure, silent still, watching. Eleanor's breath caught. A man. No, not just any man. His form was lean, poised, his hair long and dark against his shoulders. A warrior. She barely had time to register the details before he disappeared back into the trees. Had she imagined it? She darted a glance toward McGraw and his men. They hadn't seen him. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. Someone was out there. Someone who wasn't part of McGraw's gang. Hope sparked, fragile and flickering deep in her chest. But it was short-lived. Up ahead, McGraw pulled his horse to a stop, raising a hand. "We camp here," he said. "Tie the girl up good. We ain't losing our prize." The men dismounted, dragging her down from the saddle. The ropes around her wrists were yanked tighter before she was shoved against a tree. The air smelled of damp leaves, smoke, and sweat. She clenched her fists, swallowing hard. Whoever that was in the trees, if he was still there, he was her only chance. And she would do whatever it took to make sure she didn't spend the rest of her life in the hands of Boone McGraw. The fire crackled low, casting flickering shadows against the trees. Eleanor sat with her back against the rough bark, wrists bound too tightly, her pulse hammering beneath the ropes. The outlaws lounged around the flames, their voices low, their laughter jagged. Boone McGraw leaned against a fallen log, his dark eyes glinting in the firelight as he ran a blade along the curve of his boot. She watched him carefully, cataloging every detail. The way his fingers curled around the handle, the way his men deferred to him, the way he sat utterly at ease, as if he had already won. He thought she was beaten. He thought she had no fight left. He was wrong. Beyond the ring of firelight, the night stretched wide and dark, swallowing the trees into endless shadow. Somewhere out there, a man had been watching. She had seen him, a flicker of movement in the woods, gone before she could be sure he was real. A Shawnee warrior. If he was still out there, she had no way of knowing. But she couldn't count on salvation. If she was going to survive, she had to do it herself. She shifted, testing the knots binding her wrists. Too tight to slip free. She needed something sharp, something small enough to go unnoticed. Slowly, carefully, she lowered her hands toward the ground, fingers scraping against dirt, searching. A sharp boot nudged her side. "Ain't no use," one of the outlaws sneered. "You ain't getting out of those." She didn't answer. He grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "McGraw's got plans for you. Big ones. Best not waste your strength." Her stomach twisted, but she forced her face into something cold and unreadable. She had seen what happened to women taken by men like these. She had no intention of letting it happen to her. The outlaw laughed, turning back to the fire. She exhaled, slow and silent, and shifted again, pressing her fingers into the dirt. Her heart leapt as they brushed something small and jagged. A stone, not sharp, but enough to work with. She curled her fingers around it and began to rub it against the ropes. The minutes stretched long. The night deepened. McGraw's men passed around a flask, voices slurring as exhaustion took them. One by one, they nodded off, some slumped against their saddles, others sprawled on the ground. McGraw was the last to sleep, his chin dipping to his chest, breath steady and even. This was her chance. She worked faster, ignoring the burn against her skin, the ache in her shoulders. The rope frayed, split. She was free. Slowly, she eased her hands apart, wincing as blood rushed back into her fingers. She scanned the camp. The horses were tethered just beyond the fire, their ears flicking, tails swishing. If she could reach one, she could be gone before they even woke. She rose, careful not to make a sound. A twig snapped. She froze. A man stirred, mumbling in his sleep, shifting against the dirt. She held her breath. He didn't wake. She moved again, step by step, heart pounding. The horses loomed ahead, their dark forms blending into the night. She reached for the nearest one, a chestnut mare with wide, nervous eyes. Another step, another. A hand clamped around her wrist. She barely had time to gasp before she was yanked backward, colliding hard with a solid chest. Well, McGraw murmured against her ear. "Ain't you a clever little thing?" Panic surged through her. She twisted, clawing at his grip, but he was too strong. "Thought you'd run," he mused, dragging her toward the fire. "Thought we wouldn't notice?" The camp stirred. Men groaned, rubbing sleep from their eyes, reaching for their guns. McGraw shoved her forward. She stumbled, barely catching herself before she hit the ground. "Bind her tight this time," he ordered. "Hands and feet." A cruel chuckle rippled through the group. Eleanor's breath came fast. No. She couldn't let this happen. Then, from the darkness, a sound. A sharp whistle. The outlaws stiffened. The horses snorted, shifting uneasily. Then chaos. A shadow erupted from the trees, swift and silent. A man, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, a tomahawk flashing in the firelight. The Shawnee warrior. McGraw barely had time to curse before the man was upon them. The first outlaw went down with a dull thud, an arrow buried in his chest. The second fumbled for his gun, but the warrior was faster, his blade finding flesh with deadly precision. Eleanor didn't wait. She lunged, slamming her elbow into the outlaw nearest to her. He grunted, staggering back. The camp exploded into movement. Gunfire roared. Eleanor ducked, grabbing the knife from the fallen outlaw's belt, slicing through the ropes still dangling from her wrists. McGraw was shouting, barking orders, try to regain control. The warrior moved like a ghost, weaving between the outlaws, his strikes swift and lethal. Eleanor didn't think. She acted. She grabbed a discarded pistol, turned, and fired. The shot rang out, missing McGraw by inches. He whirled toward her, eyes burning with rage. "Girl," he snarled. She ran. The warrior caught her by the arm, yanking her toward the trees. She barely registered his touch before they were moving, sprinting into the shadows. Behind them, McGraw cursed. After them, bullets sliced through the leaves. They ran faster. The warrior led, his grip firm, his pace unrelenting. Branches toward her dress, dirt kicked up beneath her boots. Her lungs burned. They plunged deeper into the woods, the shouts of the outlaws growing fainter, more distant. Then silence. The warrior slowed, pulling her down beside him behind a fallen log. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. She nodded, her breath ragged. The night stretched, thick with tension. Distantly, McGraw's voice echoed. "Fan out. Find them." The warrior didn't move. Neither did she. The minutes crawled. The outlaws searched, their voices coming closer, then drifting away. Finally, the forest settled. The warrior exhaled, easing back onto his heels. Eleanor swallowed hard, her pulse still thundering in her ears. For the first time, she truly looked at him. He was young, maybe only a few years older than she was, but his eyes held a weight far beyond his years. His face was sharp, his features chiseled, his gaze unreadable. He studied her just as intently. She licked her lips, choosing her words carefully. "You helped me." He didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "You were not meant to be theirs." Something in her chest tightened. She glanced back toward the camp, where McGraw's men still searched. "They won't stop," she murmured. The warrior's gaze was steady. "Then neither will we." A shiver ran through her, not from fear, but from something else. For the first time since she had been taken, she felt something close to hope. And she was not alone. The forest was a whisper of wind and distant night sounds, stretching wide and dark in every direction. Eleanor followed the warrior in silence, her breath coming in sharp pulls as they moved deeper into the shadows. The ache in her muscles had settled into something dull and constant, but she pressed forward, matching his careful steps. He moved like a ghost. His presence felt more than seen, his strides swift and deliberate. She had questions, too many, but none of them mattered more than survival. McGraw and his men were still out there, and she knew they would never stop hunting her. The warrior slowed, then lifted a hand. Eleanor halted, every nerve in her body taut. He cocked his head, listening. She strained her ears, but heard nothing beyond the rustling trees. After a long breath, he motioned for her to follow. They came upon a clearing where the earth sloped downward, forming a shallow ravine. At its center, a small fire flickered, contained within a circle of stones. A lean horse stood tethered to a branch, its ears flicking at their arrival. The place was temporary, no more than a pause between destinations. The warrior crouched near the fire, his fingers brushing against the dirt, and gestured for her to sit. Eleanor hesitated before lowering herself onto a flat rock. The heat of the fire stung against her chilled skin. She studied him as he untied a small leather pouch from his belt, and poured water into a carved wooden bowl. He had saved her life, risked himself for her, and yet she knew nothing about him. Finally, she found her voice. "What's your name?" He looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. Then after a pause, he spoke. "Lakota." The word felt foreign on her tongue, but strong, like something that could not be broken. "I'm Eleanor," she said. "I know." Her brow furrowed. "Ow!" His gaze drifted toward the fire. "Your father is a man who makes enemies easily." The words landed like a stone in her chest. "You knew him?" Lakota's silence was answer enough. Eleanor clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "I suppose it doesn't matter," she said bitterly. "I ain't got a father anymore." Lakota watched her, measuring her words. "Blood does not bind the heart," he said at last. "What he did to you, he is not your family." She swallowed against the tightness in her throat, the truth of his words settling deep inside her. A branch cracked in the distance. Eleanor stiffened, reaching instinctively for the pistol tucked in her waistband. Lakota was already moving, rising to his feet, his gaze locked on the trees. Then another sound, hoofbeats. They came fast, pounding against the earth. Lakota snuffed out the fire with a swift kick of dirt. Eleanor scrambled up beside him, heart hammering. The moonlight glinted off steel as he drew a long knife from his belt. The riders were closing in. "Move," he ordered. She ran. Lakota kept close, leading her through the dense underbrush, his steps impossibly quiet. Eleanor struggled to match his pace, branches snagging her sleeves, roots threatening to trip her. Behind them, voices rose. McGraw's men. They were close. Too close. Lakota veered suddenly, pulling her sharply to the right. She barely managed to keep her footing as they plunged into a dry creek bed. He crouched low behind the rocks, motioning for her to do the same. She dropped beside him, panting, pressing herself against the cool earth. Above them, the hoofbeats slowed. The men were near. McGraw's voice cut through the dark. "Fan out. She's here." Eleanor gripped the pistol, her knuckles white. She could hear them dismounting, boots hitting the ground, the creak of leather as they unsheathed weapons. Lakota's fingers brushed her arm. She turned to him, barely able to see his face in the dim light. He motioned toward a narrow gap in the rocks behind them. "An escape." She nodded, inching backward, careful not to disturb the loose gravel. A gunshot split the air. She flinched. The bullet struck the rock inches from her hand. They had seen her. Lakota moved fast, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her through the opening. She stumbled, catching herself just as another shot rang out. They ran. The shouts of the outlaws followed them, gunfire cracking through the night. Eleanor's breath came in ragged gasps, her legs burning as she pushed forward. Lakota suddenly veered left, pulling her toward a fallen log. Without hesitation, he shoved her down behind it and crouched beside her. "We cannot outrun them," he said, voice low. Her pulse pounded. "Then what?" "Fight." Her stomach tightened. "There's too many." He met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "Then we make them fewer." She gripped the pistol tighter. She wasn't a fighter, not like him, but she would rather die here than go back to McGraw. Lakota reached into his belt, drawing another blade. He handed it to her, the handle warm from his touch. "Do not hesitate," he said. Eleanor swallowed hard and nodded. The first outlaw crashed through the brush. Lakota moved like a shadow, striking fast. His tomahawk sliced through the air, finding its mark. The man dropped without a sound. Eleanor barely had time to react before another outlaw burst through the trees. She raised the pistol. Her hands were shaking. The man charged. She pulled the trigger. The recoil jolted through her arm. The shot struck the outlaw in the chest, and he staggered before collapsing. A breath shuddered from her lips. Another came. Lakota met him head-on, his blade flashing, his movements fluid and precise. More shots. More shouts. Eleanor fired again. Missed. She ducked, fumbling with the revolver, her fingers slick with sweat. Then McGraw's voice. "Enough." The gunfire stopped. Eleanor's breath came in sharp gasps. McGraw stepped into view, his pistol raised. "Drop your weapons," he ordered, "or she dies." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. It wasn't Lakota he had at gunpoint. It was her. She hadn't even heard the outlaw creep up behind her, hadn't felt the cold steel pressed against the base of her skull until now. Lakota's jaw tightened, but he didn't lower his blade. McGraw's grin was slow and cruel. Ain't no winning this, warrior. Eleanor's mind raced. If Lakota surrendered, they were both as good as dead. If she moved, the man behind her would pull the trigger. There had to be a way out. Then movement. Lakota shifted, his fingers barely noticeable against the hilt of his weapon. A silent question. Eleanor understood. Her grip tightened on the knife. McGraw took a step closer. I'll make this real simple. Eleanor moved. She drove the blade backward, sinking it deep. The outlaw behind her let out a strangled gasp, his grip loosening. Lakota struck. In one swift motion, he hurled his tomahawk. It found its mark. McGraw staggered, his pistol slipping from his grasp. He clutched at his chest, eyes wide with disbelief, before collapsing into the dirt. Silence. Eleanor's breath came in sharp bursts, her hands stained red. McGraw was dead. The remaining outlaws hesitated, eyes darting between their fallen leader and the two who had defied him. Lakota bent, retrieved his weapon, and stood. Run, he said. They did. Eleanor swayed, exhaustion crashing over her. Lakota caught her before she could fall. She looked up at him, her vision swimming. We won. He didn't answer. The night stretched wide and silent in the wake of the battle, the scent of blood mingling with damp earth. Eleanor stood still, her breath ragged, fingers trembling as she wiped the knife against her torn skirts. McGraw was dead. His body lay sprawled in the dirt, eyes open but unseeing, the cruel smirk finally wiped from his face. His men had fled, scattered into the night like frightened animals, leaving their leader to rot in the dust. But it wasn't over. The weight of it pressed against her ribs. As much as she wanted to believe this was the end, that Boone McGraw's death meant she was free, she knew better. He had been the blade, not the hand that had driven it into her back. Her father had sold her, had chosen silver over blood, and that was a betrayal she could not ignore. Lakota stood beside her, his tomahawk gleaming dark with fresh blood. His breath was steady, his gaze fixed on the empty horizon. Even in the stillness, he was poised for war, his body a bowstring drawn tight. She turned to him, throat dry. They'll be back, she said, though it wasn't a question. He nodded. Some will, some won't. Her grip tightened around the pistol. She had never killed before tonight. Now, the weight of it sat heavy in her bones. Lakota studied her. You are not who you were. She swallowed. I don't know who I am anymore. The wind stirred, carrying the distant howls of wolves, the final mourners in this blood-soaked night. Lakota turned toward the trees. Come. She hesitated, glancing once more at McGraw's lifeless form before following him into the dark. The journey back to the Calloway homestead was a quiet one, the only sound the rhythm of their steps against the dirt. She had spent years walking this land, but tonight it felt different, as if the trees themselves had shifted, grown taller, more unforgiving. She stole a glance at Lakota, moving effortlessly beside her, his expression unreadable. He had saved her, more than once, but she still didn't know why. Why help me? She asked finally. His jaw tensed. McGraw took many before you. Her stomach twisted. She didn't have to ask what had happened to them. The answer was already written in his eyes. They reached the ridge overlooking the homestead just before dawn. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, but the place looked different now, smaller, as if the walls had caved inward beneath the weight of what had been done here. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Lakota's voice was quiet. Will you kill him? She thought about it. She thought about the way her father had looked at her when McGraw dragged her from their home, like she was already gone, like she was nothing more than a debt settled. She thought about the way he had slumped in his chair, the way he had avoided her eyes, even as she begged him to tell her it wasn't real. She thought about the way her mother used to hum while brushing Eleanor's hair, how she had whispered stories of warriors and wild women who carved their own fate. And then she thought about what she had become. Her hand hovered near the pistol at her hip. I don't know. She descended the ridge, Lakota, a silent shadow at her back. The door creaked open beneath her hand. The inside of the cabin smelled of whiskey and stale regret. Her father sat where she had last seen him, slumped at the table, a bottle dangling from his fingers. He didn't look up. She stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The wood groaned beneath her boots. Pa! The word felt foreign on her tongue. Jed Calloway lifted his head, bleary-eyed. For a long moment, he only stared, as if she were a ghost returned from the grave. His face was hollowed with drink, his skin sagging beneath the weight of his sins. He blinked. Eleanor. She didn't answer. His gaze flickered to the gun at her hip. Figure McGraw'd kill you, he muttered. His voice was thick with liquor, but there was no real surprise in it. Something inside her snapped. You sold me, she said, her voice quiet, deadly. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Didn't have a choice. The words hit her like a slap. She had told herself he would beg, that he would fall to his knees and tell her he had been wrong, that he had been desperate. But now, seeing him like this, she realized the truth. He had never intended to save her. He had never even tried. You had a choice, she whispered. You just didn't pick me. His hand trembled around the bottle. You don't understand. She took a step closer. Then make me. His throat bobbed. For the first time, his gaze flickered past her toward the figure standing in the doorway. His face paled. A Shawnee? Lakota didn't move, didn't speak, but the air in the room shifted, thick with something unsaid. Jed Calloway slowly pushed himself upright, his chair scraping against the floor. You think you're something now, girl? His voice was quiet, trembling with something too bitter to be fear. Run in with warriors? You think that makes you more than what you are? She met his eyes. I think it makes me free. His expression twisted. She drew the pistol. For the first time, real fear flashed in his gaze. She cocked the hammer. Did you ever love me? He flinched. Don't do this, Eleanor. The silence stretched long and thin between them. She could end it now. One pull of the trigger, and he would never sell another, never drink away another night while someone else paid for his mistakes. But Lakota's words echoed in her mind. Blood does not bind the heart. She took a step back, lowering the gun. Her father exhaled, shoulders sagging with something dangerously close to relief. She didn't give him the chance. She turned, grabbed the oil lamp from the table, and hurled it against the wall. Flames roared to life, licking hungrily at the wood. Her father cursed, staggering backward. What are you? You already lost me, she said, voice steady. Now you can lose this, too. The fire spread fast, climbing the walls, devouring the past one crackling ember at a time. She stepped outside. Lakota watched her carefully. You did not kill him. She shook her head. No. He nodded, as if this was the answer he had expected. Behind her, the cabin burned, the smoke rising like a ghost against the dawn sky. She didn't look back. Lakota mounted his horse and offered her his hand. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. The sun broke over the horizon as they rode. Eleanor didn't know where she was going, but for the first time, she knew she wasn't running.